So welcome to the history of Riverside, 90 years. This session is going to be about social justice, and Vince is going to sort of drive this topic. It's one of his areas of expertise, something he's really interested and good at studying. So I thought I'd give him the opportunity to tackle this one. So I'm going to mute myself, and Vince, take it away.
Hi, everybody. How are you guys doing? Hope you're having a nice weekend. I wanted to, well, I had asked you guys via email to be thinking about what your sort of personal definition of social justice is. And I'd be happy if someone wants to offer, a definition to we could listen to some people first, but I can also just jump in. I lost my view of everybody, so but unless there's no hands, I'll move on. But basically, I think Riverside's connections with movements for social justice are so many and so consistent that it would be impossible for me to do in just an hour and a half to actually go through everything that's ever happened at Riverside related to social justice. So instead, I kind of wanted to walk us through a few revealing events throughout Riverside's history that show us some important things about Riverside's relationship with social justice. And I want to hear from you guys, if you guys, I think especially as we get later into my presentation, some of you may have had personal experiences with these events, and so I'd love to hear from you guys. But social justice is a really complex and contested idea. There's different people have very different ideas about what social justice is and how to achieve it. It's a term that's been used in many different ways. Perhaps the first modern version or description of social justice was by John Stuart Mill in 1861 in Utilitarianism, where, I won't read the whole thing here on the left, but basically he says that there should be equal outcome there should be equal outcome in society. People who have deserved equally well of us should be treated equally well. That society should treat all equally well who have deserved equally well of it. In short, he's saying essentially justice is putting into action this moral duty that we have to ensure that individuals get what they deserve. And the term came to be used much more commonly in the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century during various fights for labor regulations like the 8-hour workday and the right to join a labor union. And it was actually the definitive use of the term social justice was credited to the International Labor Organization, which was one of the agencies that was built by the League of Nations in the early 20th century and is today still part of the United Nations. And the preamble of the ILO, again, I won't read the whole thing, but part of it's here. But it says, whereas universal and lasting peace can only be established if it is based upon social justice. And whereas conditions of labor exist involving such injustice, hardship, and privation to large numbers of people as to produce unrest so great that the peace and harmony of the world are imperiled. And it goes on to list sort of various things that might cause labor unrest, and it ties labor unrest around the world to a larger project of global peace. And basically suggests that, we need to have certain labor rights for everyone in order to prevent sort of various uprisings. There's probably some reference here to the Russian Revolution and trying to avoid future such situations. But from early on, even very early on, not long after the term social justice is used by the International Labor Organization in this way, it's already becomes a contested idea that people are using not necessarily in good faith. The American fascist radio chaplain Father Charles Coughlin, who was a Catholic priest and was in some ways kind of the the supervillain to Fosdick's superhero at the time of the 30s and 40s, and these competitions between more fundamentalist and more modernist preachers on the radio, more progressive and more conservative views. And so Father Charles Coughlin was sort of the far right version to Fosdick's more liberal version on the radio. But Fosdick actually ran a magazine titled Social Justice in the 30s and 40s, which, among other things, published speeches by Joseph Goebbels. It published the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is a fabricated anti-Semitic text that purported to show that a cabal of Jewish leaders was going to take over banking and the media. And Social Justice also helped sort of create and propagate this longstanding myth that Marxism was a ploy by European Jewish intellectuals to subvert American values. Both Protocols and the cultural Marxist myth are still major keystones of the white nationalist and neo-Nazi movement today. So those have these origins in this magazine called Social Justice, which we hold, progressives like us hold this to be, this is our goal, social justice, but different people have used this term and in very different ways than others might use. So all this is to say that social justice has very different meanings to different groups, and that these meanings are at times contradictory, and what the goals and strategies of someone pursuing social justice might be very different depending on the time and place and their historical and political outlook. And so I just wanted to spend some time on that definition. I don't want to belabor the point, but I think it is important that if we want to think critically about Riverside's history of social justice, that we can't view it as just a straight line, or that there's just one group of people who's pursuing social justice, but actually there's like a whole history, is this whole series of pitched battles between opposing viewpoints, and sometimes there's a victory for one side, sometimes there's a victory for the other. And so Riverside's history is an example of these contradictions at times. There's sort of a more liberal and a more progressive set of political values, which are kind of orbiting each other and contradicting each other at times. And while they might have similar end goals, they disagree often about sort of short-term strategy. For example, and I'll get into this more deeply later, but we consider Dr. Martin Luther King's Beyond Vietnam speech at Riverside, and today the church holds this as like a key moment in Riverside history. We're very proud of this moment, and it was a moment where Riverside was kind of, in many ways at its best. The pulpit became a national soapbox about an important living political activists addressing one of the most important ongoing failures in our country, the Vietnam War. And so in many ways, Riverside, in retrospect, has kind of claimed a partnership in that, and has sort of taken on, the importance of the Beyond Vietnam is also our importance as well. In addition to being Martin Luther King's speech, it's also something that happened at Riverside, and we get to sort of clothe ourselves in the armor of being associated with this. But at the time, it was much more controversial. It was not sort of everyone at Riverside was super happy about this. It was remarkably controversial. And originally, the event wasn't even intended to be held at Riverside. It was only as a favor to the president of the Union Theological Seminary right across the street from us. The president at the time, John C. Bennett, was one of the members of the clergy and laymen concerned about Vietnam, which organized the event. And it was really just as a favor to him that we allowed this event to have at Riverside. So when it was realized it was going to be much too large to hold a UTS, so just sort of as a favor, we let them host it there. And so in the aftermath, there were editorials all over the country. The New York Times, the Washington Post castigated King for the unpatriotic act of questioning the war. And within Riverside, there were many who wanted McCracken, the senior minister at the time, to distance the church and distance himself from King, for critiquing the Vietnam War. And it's possible even that this controversy contributed to McCracken leaving just a few months later. So many today would agree with King's assessment that the Vietnam War was a moral and strategic failure, but at the time, there was this tremendous fissure in Riverside's congregation, and that fissure, I think, tells us a lot about the history of movements for social justice. And I think it can be really instructive for thinking about how similar movements have played out at other times, and also how movements now are playing out, and how sort of different ideas about justice and what to do next, sort of these sort of schisms within the church can sort of play out again and again. Before I move on to the next section, did anyone have any questions or thoughts? Okay. Please.
Hi, yeah, I'm Emily Walker Burkita. So I'm going to be connected in a couple of sessions, but I'm a lifer. I'll reveal my age. I'm 63. I was born attending Riverside, and I grew up in Riverside. So what I remember as a child was not the fissure, actually. I remember the joy of being free to support this, and my family and my parents, and that it was sort of a minor, his speeches happened, and then they happened, to the world, as you were saying, we sort of owned it after the fact. They were ours, and it happened. And I was a little kid, so the adults and the fissure, was not happening on my level, but it was important. We were being brought up that this was important.
Yeah.
As the Riverside family, and then working through the challenges of that. So, yeah, thanks for sharing that. That's interesting. Yeah.
Thank you. We're going to talk a little bit more about that period in Riverside in a little bit, but I wanted to sort of go from the beginning. But that was just sort of that's my favorite example, or one of my favorite examples, I think, of these things that have become part of the legend of Riverside, but are at the time were maybe much more controversial than we sort of, advertise or something like that. So, but I think, yeah, it was probably, I want to hear very much people's personal experiences of these things, because I'm just experiencing it through archival materials, and so people's personal experiences is much more insightful, I think. So I'll move on. I think one of the interesting places to start, I mean, from the very, very beginning of Riverside, it's useful to go back to the beginning. In our first class, we had discussed the founding of the church as a partnership between John D. Rockefeller Jr. and Reverend Harry Emerson Fosdick. And you may recall from that class, I remember noticing this, we sort of alluded to the fact that there was some difficulty Rockefeller had finding a leader for this great cathedral he wanted to build. And he had actually gone to other churches first. He had gone to St. John the Divine, hoping to help them complete their church, and they had refused. They refused him. They refused to let him even be on their board, let alone help them build the church. And it took Rockefeller several tries to convince Fosdick to work with him. It took a lot of convincing, several years, in fact. And so I wanted to kind of go into a little bit about why was that, and sort of what that says about Riverside today. And starting out with Fosdick's involvement with the social gospel, which was, a movement in preaching, and I'm not a theologian. If there's somebody here who knows more about it, please speak up. But essentially, it's applying sort of biblical stories to current social events, current political events. And so Fosdick was associated with this sort of newish movement at the time, and was also quite open about critiquing economic inequality, even very early on. In June of 1912, he wrote an article for The Outlook, which was a weekly magazine based in New York City, associated with Teddy Roosevelt's progressive movement. And Fosdick's article discussed the events of the Lawrence textile strike, which is also known as the Bread and Roses strike. There's a famous song, Bread and Roses, which comes from that strike. And it was undertaken largely by immigrant women and led by the industrial workers of the world. And while Fosdick people have critiqued Fosdick in this article for sort of leaving out some of the grosser labor violations that were going on, the labor abuses that the workers were facing, he's very unambiguous in his support of the workers over the bosses, and he's also very approving of the tactics that the International Workers of the World organization used. And he, one of the lines in the article is that he says that the nobility of France before the revolution could not have been more blind to the situation than some of the Bostonese. He's very sort of open about critiquing the people who aren't siding with the workers in this strike. And so this same year, for some context, in Teddy, as I said, Teddy Roosevelt was associated with this magazine as well. Teddy Roosevelt was running for president that year on the Progressive Party ticket. And one of the sort of key aspects of his platform was the 8-hour workday, which is part of what the Bread and Roses strike was trying to achieve. So the social gospel movement, of which Fosdick was a part, was heavily associated with the progressive movement, some even sort of calling it basically just the religious wing of the progressive movement at the time. So we can see that early on, Fosdick is paying attention to labor issues, paying attention to sort of current political events, and he's really concerned with sort of the little guy. On the other hand, about the same time, in April 20 of 1914, at a mine owned by the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, a tent city of around 1,000 striking mine workers in Ludlow, Colorado, was fired upon by guards hired by the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company with support from the Colorado National Guard. And 21 people were killed immediately, including women, including children. The tent city that they had built, these striking miners, was burned to the ground, and all those people's possessions was destroyed. The miners had been striking for recognition of basic rights that they were already supposedly guaranteed, like the 8-hour workday, and the right to choose where to live and which doctor to see, and the right to be paid in cash as opposed to scrip. Among those killed by the gunfire and the subsequent fire was Louis Tikas, the organizer of the strike. And the attack set off days of fighting between mine workers and mine guards across Colorado, and was only halted when President Woodrow Wilson sent in federal troops. And the death toll of the wider Colorado Coalfield War is estimated to be about 200 people. And so the strike ended in December of 1920 with no concessions from Colorado Fuel and Iron. Colorado Fuel and Iron at the time was owned by the Rockefeller family, with John D. Rockefeller Jr. as its president. The Ludlow Massacre, as it's now known, was widely believed at the time to have been directly ordered by John D. Rockefeller Jr. And so there was sort of huge national public outcry and about this. Margaret Sanger, who was the pioneer feminist and the founder of Planned Parenthood, wrote in her publication, The Wimwood Rebel, that year, "But remember Ludlow, remember the men, women, and children who were sacrificed in order that John D. Rockefeller Jr. might continue his noble career of charity and philanthropy as a supporter of the Christian faith." Anarchist Alexander Berkman, who had served time in prison for an attempted assassination of the anti-union industrialist Henry Clay Frick, which many of us may be familiar with the Frick Museum, in 1892, he planned a similar attempt on John D. Rockefeller's life in June of 1914, just after the massacre, 3 months later. And after several weeks of sort of bussing people up to his home in Tarrytown every day to picket outside of his house, they decided to build a bomb and try to plant it outside of his house. And the attempt was aborted on July 4th, 1914, when the explosive was accidentally set off in an apartment near Lexington and 103rd, leveling the top 3 floors of the apartment building. So the NYPD actually created its first bomb squad in the following weeks in response. And there was a campaign of attempted assassinations with explosives of various industrialists and sort of anti-union, individuals and stuff like that throughout the rest of the summer. So there was just this massive national outcry, huge sort of public resentment of industrialists, in particular John D. Rockefeller Jr., and a campaign of sort of attempted political assassinations, across, especially in New York, but throughout the country, all the rest of the year. And so this was just a massive public relations nightmare. And so it was actually that year that Rockefeller hired Ivy Lee. Ivy Lee was one of the first public relations experts. Sort of him and Edward Bernays are sort of credited with creating the public relations industry. Edward Bernays was actually, interestingly, I think Freud's nephew or grandnephew or something like that. And Edward Bernays Ivy Lee sort of created public relations as a job, and Edward Bernays sort of professionalized it and turned it into an academic field of study. But Ivy Lee was sort of Edward Bernays's mentor. And so Rockefeller hired Ivy Lee in the hopes that he could sort of figure out a way to soften the public image of the Rockefellers and sort of make up for, or in some way kind of, do something about this terrible association that was had with Rockefeller throughout the country. And his advice was to try to humanize the Rockefellers' image, in part by taking part in philanthropic endeavors, such as helping to fund the expansion of the Metropolitan Opera, doing various real estate development projects throughout New York, such as what would become Rockefeller Center or 30 Rock. And additionally, Harry Emerson Fosdick's brother, Raymond Fosdick, was also a close advisor of Rockefeller's starting in the late 1910s, and similarly sort of advised Rockefeller to avoid this public relations crisis by attempting to create this image of himself as a liberal industrial statesman. So try to change his image from being this sort of anti-labor industrialist, and instead sort of try to spin himself as being associated with this liberal and progressive movement, and as something more than just a boss or an executive of a mining company, but something like a statesman, something on the level of a president or a senator or something like that. Try to elevate his image to be sort of above it all, or above sort of the considerations of the day-to-day work in the industries that he was operating in. So by 1920, Raymond Fosdick would become a trustee of the Rockefeller Foundation, and in 1936, he'd become the chairman of the foundation. And so it was no accident that in 1922, it was Ivy Lee's advice that John D. Rockefeller Jr. personally helped fund the distribution of Raymond Fosdick's brother, Harry Emerson Fosdick's pamphlet, Shall the Fundamentalists Win? This was an effort by Rockefeller to kind of associate himself with this more progressive wing of Protestantism at the time. And it was also Lee who had first initiated and started organizing and helping to finance building a church for Dr. Fosdick. So jumping ahead a few years, it was, Fosdick lost his position at, was it First Presbyterian, Diana? He lost his position at First Presbyterian because of his association with this fundamentalist controversy, and was very quickly hired by Rockefeller to be one of the ministers at Park Avenue Baptist Church, which was sort of, at the time, Rockefeller's central church. And it was in the mid-1920s when Fosdick and Rockefeller had a meeting, which many of us may be familiar with. I'm sure many of you have read this scene or heard this story in some way or another, but this is from Fosdick's autobiography. He said, John D. Rockefeller Jr. invited me to lunch and broached the matter. Would I consider succeeding my friend Cornelius Wolfkin, whose retirement was imminent? Wolfkin would retire in 1926. And I said, I thanked him, and I said did not see how I could do that. Skipping ahead a little bit, Rockefeller asked again, and there was some sort of question of baptism. Fosdick didn't want to pastor a congregation that required immersion, and then Rockefeller basically offered, well, what if we don't do that? And he asked whether, Fosdick says, I would still say no. And once more he asked why, and I replied, he still said no. And he was like, well, what if we, still say no. He was once more asked why. He said, Park Avenue Baptist Church is in like the wealthiest, swankiest neighborhood in the country. I don't want to be sort of associated with this, rich as God image. So Rockefeller inquired, if we moved to another site and built a church, equipped to serve a more metropolitan community, would I be a pastor then? Rockefeller says, well, you just built a church, but I would not become the minister. And Rockefeller asked again, and Fosdick said, because you are too wealthy and I do not want to be known as the pastor of the richest man in the country. Dead silence followed, and he said, I like your frankness, but do you think that more people will criticize you on account of my wealth than will criticize me on account of your theology? So already Rockefeller is sort of, coming to Fosdick and trying to convince him to join him. And Fosdick is very, very reticent because of the association that Rockefeller has, especially considering that, Fosdick's associated with this more social gospel style, and Rockefeller is sort of like the big bad of that viewpoint at the time. So even when Fosdick finally does become the senior minister at Riverside, he's already this is even before this. There were already butting heads, Rockefeller and Fosdick, over Fosdick's liberalism on industrial relations. And so in 1927, the same year that the cornerstone was laid for Riverside, Rockefeller wrote to Fosdick sort of critiquing his sermon and saying that he wasn't fair to industry. And Fosdick, for his part, was firm. He defended the statements. He was contending that even he positioned these issues to Rockefeller as the very problem on which you are so long and faithfully have labored. So yeah, Fosdick was, fighting with Rockefeller from very early on about industrial issues and Fosdick's liberalism on industrial issues. So jumping ahead to the 1930s, John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s reputation was such that even 16 years after the Ludlow massacre in October of 1930, deep into the worst years of the Depression, Time magazine reported that Pinkertons, which are sort of the private security of the day and were often hired by industrialists to break strikes and to guard mines and factories, that Pinkertons had been hired by Rockefeller to guard the construction site of Riverside, because the fear was still, even for 16 years after the Ludlow massacre, that sort of people would be trying to damage Rockefeller's construction sites because of his association with the massacre. So basically this sort of general feeling that Rockefeller was this sort of anti-union industrialist led to Fosdick making these really strong demands on Rockefeller in order for him to even agree to pastor the church. And that included moving to Morningside Heights, and that included the sort of interdenominational and international mission of Riverside. And the move from Morningside, move from Midtown Manhattan to Morningside was sort of intended to distance Riverside from the sort of fancy mansions of Midtown at the time, and instead associated with this sort of more pluralistic and educational environment that was in Morningside Heights. Columbia University had just recently moved to the Morningside Heights area. But even after Fosdick had already become kind of considered by the general public to be Rockefeller's kind of court cleric, he continued to criticize inequality and industrial capitalism of the time, and saying in 1935 sermon, there's Fosdick and Rockefeller together. But saying in 1935 in his sermon, The Ethical Foundations of Prosperity, we had often talked about the moral regrettableness of our inequality of income, but now maldistribution has become one of the chief economic problems of mankind. For the crucial matter with us economically is that we need consumers. We need them tremendously. Under our capitalistic system, we have wrought one of the most amazing miracles in history, the creation of a productive system of supplying anything that mankind may need. But we need consumers who can buy what can be produced, and there are not enough of them. We have supposed it was only an economic question, but Jesus was right. Ethical questions precede, underlie, dominate economic questions. The ethical test of every economic process, therefore, is that it is primarily devoted not to making money for a few, but to enriching the life of all. This sort of rhetoric had led in 1930, a few years prior, for Fosdick's sermon, "The Ghost of a Chance," to lead to the Congressman Hamilton Fish, who was the chairman of the Fish Committee, which was this committee tasked with sort of finding communists and anarchists. Hamilton Fish had, this Fish Committee had also gone after the ACLU and gone after other sort of progressive liberal organizations. And Hamilton Fish had called Fosdick one of the pink intellectuals and sobbing socialists. So, I hope I stumbled there in a little bit in the middle, but I'm hoping that what I was trying to draw out with this story about the founding of Riverside and the complications between Fosdick and Rockefeller, among other things, sort of, it's been said of philanthropy that the rich give nothing outright, but regard their gifts as a business matter, and making a bargain with the poor, saying, if I spend this much upon benevolent institutions, I thereby purchase the right not to be troubled any further. I think we can sort of see in the context of the history of what was going on with Rockefeller at the time, that he had this really serious public relations issue on his hand in the second half of the 1910s. And he was endeavoring to transform the reputation of his family by taking part in various philanthropic activities, such as supporting arts institutions like the Met Museum and the Met Opera, supporting the YMCA, supporting the National Council of Churches, and by helping to construct Riverside Church. And Fosdick, for his part, at first refused Rockefeller's offer to build him a church, and no doubt fearing the ill repute that might come with associating with such an infamous industrialist. But eventually Fosdick did accept Rockefeller's offer. And so Riverside then, I think, is kind of bound to contend with these contradictions from the beginning of philanthropy versus social justice, or of these sort of these two founders, Rockefeller and Fosdick, kind of representing two very different political orientations and economic viewpoints, and that sort of Fosdick is strongly associated with the social gospel, and remains a huge figure in what the social gospel would become later on in the century. But then this is maybe to some people's view kind of tainted by his association with Rockefeller, who sort of only stood to benefit from associating with someone who was seen as sort of softer on economic issues. And so that this kind of question remains of, did Fosdick sort of sacrifice some of his ideals in doing this, or was this was this decision sort of justified by what Riverside, sort of could later become? I think, I think these are open questions. I'm not trying to suggest any one viewpoint, but I think, I think these open questions sort of open up a lot about what happens later on in Riverside's history, and also sort of maybe questions today about sort of social justice issues at Riverside and social justice issues in our country in general, about how these sort of competing, these competing and contradictory forces kind of sometimes support each other and build upon each other, and what that means. Are there any questions about all of that? I went through that very quickly, but I just wanted to, I have a lot of material to go through, so I just wanted to, I was kind of rushing there. But is there any questions or thoughts?
Vince, is that quote, is that Fosdick in that sermon?
Which one?
The quote about the rich give nothing outright.
That's Friedrich Engels, actually. I wasn't going to attribute that one immediately, but yes, that's Friedrich Engels. Anything else? Thank you for the question, Lynn. I was reticent to put the name next to it. Anything else? Okay. So jumping ahead to the 1960s, I wanted to sort of talk about Riverside's relationship with the Black freedom struggle. We have sort of two major events associated with that at Riverside. Obviously, a huge amount has happened throughout our history related to, the Black freedom struggle, both in America and in South Africa and throughout the world. But sort of the two major events, if you had to choose two, it would be kind of beyond Vietnam, or Martin Luther King's visits in general, and then James Forman storming the chancel in 1969. Throughout the 1960s, Martin Luther King regularly delivered sermons from the pulpit at Riverside Church, starting in August of 1961 through to January of 1966. MLK's final appearance at Riverside was making the speech Beyond Vietnam, which called into question the moral and strategic advisability of continuing the Vietnam War. And controversially, there were several controversies, but one of the major controversies was tying the moral failure that was the war to the moral failure of the racism and poverty Black Americans faced at home. King was heavily influenced by Fosdick. I think, in fact, called Fosdick one of his favorite preachers. And in particular, Fosdick's version of the social gospel, as we talked about, sort of applying biblical stories to modern social issues. And we see that right from the beginning in King's first appearance at Riverside Pulpit in August of 1961, when he delivered Paul's letter to American Christians. This was a sort of a version of a sermon he delivered before, but the version at Riverside is quite different from the other sort of better known published versions of this sermon. But the sermon sort of imagines St. Paul writing a letter to modern America, and in particular addressing segregation, but social issues in general. And King is sort of speaking in Paul's voice, pretending to be the voice of Paul writing this letter to America. And so from the beginning, King critiqued the materialism of modern America. He said, you've allowed the material means by which you live to outdistance the spiritual ends for which you live. You have allowed your mentality to outrun your morality. You have allowed your civilization to outdistance your culture. And so you have ended up with guided missiles and misguided men. Somehow you must be sure, America, that you will keep your moral progress abreast of your scientific progress. King critiqued the misuse of capitalism, but he was also quick to note that you cannot solve the problem by turning to communism. Sort of bear in mind, this is 1961. The McCarthy era had only ended just 4 years prior, and the United States was sort of nearing the height of the Cold War. There were ongoing proxy wars in Vietnam and Algeria, in Central America, and in the Congo. So, we can see here a real unwillingness for King to sort of go too far in critiquing America, critiquing capitalism, or critiquing our involvement in Vietnam and these other wars. He also spoke against segregation, appealing in part to scripture. He said the broad universalism at the center of the gospel makes both the theory and practice of segregation morally unjustifiable, for segregation substitutes an I-it relationship for the I-thou relationship. The underlying philosophy of segregation is diametrically opposed to the underlying philosophy of Christianity, and all the dialectics of the logicians cannot make them lie down together. Segregation is a cancer in the body politic, which must be removed before your Christian and democratic health can be realized. King also makes reference to these accusations that he had received and would receive throughout the 50s and 60s during his civil rights campaigns, that he was an outside agitator. He said, as you struggle ahead, you may be called an impractical idealist. Often there will be those who call you a dangerous rabble-rouser or a dangerous agitator. Some will even call you a communist merely because you believe in the brotherhood of man. Yes, as you struggle, it may mean that you will be thrown in jail. If such is the case, you must go into the jails and transform them from dungeons of shame to havens of freedom and human dignity. As you stand up, it may even mean physical death for some. But if physical death is the price that some must pay to free their children from a permanent life of psychological death, then nothing could be more Christian. We have all of King's appearances at Riverside. We have recordings of all of his sermons. I sent that around in an email, and I can send that again at the end of the talk. But I'm not going to go into all of the sermons, but I just sort of wanted to contrast his first sermon with Beyond Vietnam and sort of show that transformation over those 6 years. And so by the time King arrived at Riverside in April of 1967 to deliver Beyond Vietnam, this is exactly a year before his death. He was a changed man. He had new ideas about both politics and Christianity. And you can really see that by comparing Beyond Vietnam with Paul's letter to American Christians. King's attention in previous months before April 1967, sort of through the summer of 66 and into early 67, he had sort of turned his attention towards the North, especially a campaign to end housing discrimination against African Americans in Chicago. And the campaign had been very difficult, not entirely successful, and had sort of increasingly created tension between both King and the Johnson administration, as well as between King and various donors that had previously been sort of major financial backers of the SCLC, King's organization. His popularity was waning, and there was especially a feeling, I think, as I mentioned, the donors sort of pulling back from the SCLC. There was a feeling that King should stick to the South, that he should not sort of address what was going on in the North. He should not address the sort of de facto segregation that was going on in the North and in the ghettos, and then sort of the poverty in the ghettos of the northern cities like New York and Chicago. There was a feeling that he shouldn't touch that he should sort of stick to the South and not sort of branch out. So it was at the time in April of 67, as he's leading up to delivering this speech, a lot of people who are his advisors are really strongly against him talking about the Vietnam War at all, because there's already this struggle that he's having to sort of turn the attention to the plight of African Americans in the North. And so for him to sort of add on this extra weight of talking about Vietnam, there were a lot of people in his camp that were, advising him really not to do this. And he, I think fortunately ignored their advice. Going into the text of Beyond Vietnam, here's King at Riverside delivering Beyond Vietnam in April of 1967. Going into the text, he said, there is at the outset a very obvious and almost facile connection between the war in Vietnam and the struggle I and others have been waging in America. A few years ago, there was a shining moment in that struggle. It seemed that as if there was a real promise of hope for the poor, both black and white, through the poverty program. There were experiments, hopes, new beginnings. Then came the buildup in Vietnam, and I watched this program broken and eviscerated as if it were some idle political plaything of a society gone mad on war. And I knew that America would never invest the necessary funds or energies in rehabilitation of its poor so long as adventures like Vietnam continue to draw men and skills and money like some demonic, destructive suction tube. So I was increasingly compelled to see the war as an enemy of the poor and to attack it as such. So King here is referring to the War on Poverty legislation, which had been passed in 1964 and 1965, much of which had already begun to be defunded by 1967 in service of continuing the Vietnam War. And tying the war to the civil rights movement and tying the war to this failure, this really early and immediate almost failure of LBJ's Great Society programs, these anti-poverty programs. This was really one of the most controversial things that he said in Beyond Vietnam. And here's a kind of silly political cartoon from the time of Johnson telling this sort of waif that says U.S. urban needs written on her apron, and he's telling her there's enough money to support both of you. This is kind of the milieu that King is responding to here, of this frustration that LBJ had passed these really wide-reaching anti-poverty programs, and within just a year or two was defunding them in order just to continue this war. King mentions one reason for speaking out against Vietnam was coming from these discussions that he had with young people in the North who were protesting police violence, and who he'd been trying to urge to nonviolence, to remain their primary tactic. And he said, I have tried to offer them my deepest compassion while maintaining my conviction that social change comes most meaningfully through nonviolent action. But they ask, and rightly so, what about Vietnam? They ask if our own nation wasn't using massive doses of violence to solve its problems, to bring about the changes it wanted. Their questions hit home, and I knew I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without first having spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government. King, again, I had pointed this out in Paul's letter, his first sermon. He addresses American materialism, but this time in Beyond Vietnam, King, we see him much more willing to associate himself with sort of more revolutionary or anti-capitalist ideas than he was in his first sermon in 61. He said, in 1957, a sensitive American official overseas said that it seemed to him that our nation was on the wrong side of a world revolution. During the past 10 years, we have seen emerge a pattern of suppression, which has now justified the presence of U.S. military advisors in Venezuela. This need to maintain social stability for our investment accounts for the counter-revolutionary action of America. This need to maintain social stability for our investments accounts for the counter-revolutionary action of American forces in Guatemala. It tells why American helicopters are being used against guerrillas in Cambodia and why American napalm and Green Beret forces have already been active against rebels in Peru. It is with such activity in mind that the words of the late John F. Kennedy come back to haunt us. 5 years ago, he said, "Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable." Increasingly, by choice or by accident, this is the role our nation has taken. The role of those who make peaceful revolution impossible by refusing to give up the privileges and the pleasures that come from the immense profits of overseas investments. I'm convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society, when machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people. The giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. So here, King pulls no punches in tying together American materialism with the continued American military suppression of revolutionary groups abroad. And we can see that this is like a real shift in rhetoric from in 1961, when he really has to sort of, anytime he's even mildly critical of American materialism, he has to kind of couch this in is to sort of bracket it by saying, oh, I'm also an anti-communist. I'm also against revolution. But by 1967, this rhetoric has really changed, even though he's saying some very similar things. You know, he uses this thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. He uses that little phrase, but he's deploying it in quite a different way now. And he directly ties that thing-oriented society to America's foreign policy actions, suppressing movements in other countries which threaten American business interests. And so his anti-imperialism here was really, again, not only was this a big jump from what he was saying in 1961, this also, when we think about the people who were on the board of trustees at Riverside at the time, like David Rockefeller, this is like, you know, the Rockefellers and some other people, you know, this is like going directly after their own sort of foreign investments and stuff like that, and sort of their own ideas about American foreign policy. Another one of the things which was immediately controversial in King's speech was his recommendation that young men opposed to the war become conscientious objectors. He had said, I think the time has come for those of us who feel that this war is immoral and unjust to advise young men of the alternative to the draft, which is as on the basis of this Selective Service Act, and that is to serve as a conscientious objector. He said, you know, I think this is absolutely necessary. He also said, now I also mentioned the fact that we are not only caught up in a situation where I feel we're wrong in Vietnam, but if there are not some changes in our national direction and character, we're going to be in several more wars like this. There are many potential Vietnams in Latin America and in Africa and in other places in Asia. And the young men of our generation and other generations will continually confront this problem of going into armed services that are really serving as the counter-revolutionary forces of the world. I think somewhere this has to stop, and this is why I've already advised many young men that I have talked with to serve as conscientious objectors. This call was both very controversial, but also very important. It was actually just a few weeks after his talk that a huge list of people associated with the clergy and laymen concerned about Vietnam organization had signed on. Various clergymen, as well as lots of academics and deans of various universities, had said that they were going to start sort of advising and supporting their students to become conscientious objectors. After the speech, both Riverside and others really distanced themselves from King's stance, which drew this relationship between the civil rights movement and ending the war. The NAACP voted unanimously that it was a serious tactical mistake to merge the movements for peace and the civil rights movement. The New York Times and the Washington Post both published editorials sort of excoriating King's statements. And the New York Times letter to the editors section was, you know, heavily devoted to King's speech for weeks and weeks afterwards. It was a national controversy. And there was a lot of anger about King advising people to be conscientious objectors, and a lot of anger about him sort of, it was seen by some as trying to fuse the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement. And there was frustration on all sides about that, including, even as I said, the NAACP felt that this was a massive tactical error to try to fuse these two movements. Moving on to a few years later, it's probably with King's words in mind from the Beyond Vietnam speech, but also knowing that it had been quite controversial at Riverside at the time in 1967, that in May of 1969, James Forman stormed the pulpit of the Riverside Church to demand that white churches and synagogues pay reparations. So on Sunday, May 4th, 1969, Black activist James Foreman stormed the pulpit at the Riverside Church, demanding that white churches and synagogues pay $500 million in reparations. Foreman was the former executive secretary of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He was also one of the key leaders of the 1964 Freedom Summer, which was a project to bring people down to the South to register as many Black voters in Mississippi as possible. He had also been a leader in the 1965 Selma to Montgomery marches with Martin Luther King. Those were famously we see newsreels of it and all the time of, infamously put down with billy clubs and tear gas on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and that event is now known as as Bloody Sunday. So on the morning of May 4th, as ministers processed down the nave to the hymn "When Morning Gilds the Skies," Foreman climbed the steps of the chancel and began to read the Black Manifesto, which was a series of demands endorsed by the National Black Economic Development Conference. The Black Manifesto argued that white churches and synagogues of the United States must pay their part, direct and indirect, in the historical subjugation of Black people if they wish to maintain their moral authority. It cited their reliance on the patronage of wealthy whites enriched by slavery and the violent expropriation of resources from communities of color, both in the United States and internationally. But before Foreman could begin to explain the reason for the service interruption, the organist drowned out his words with the hymn "May Jesus Christ Be Praised," as the preaching minister, Reverend Ernest Campbell, led a silent walkout of the majority of the congregation. And so this event, again, just 2 years later, threw Riverside Church into the national spotlight, as well as the concept of reparations. This is one of the first major national discussions about reparations occurs because of this event. And Riverside Church and other faith groups, really struggled to respond. So as I mentioned, not only was Foreman's call deliberately initiated at Riverside because of its past public support for anti-segregationists like King, but still at the time, a whiter and a wealthier congregation than most, but also because of the church's strong association with the Rockefeller family. At a press conference the following Sunday, May 11th, Foreman said, and I always laugh at this line, he said, "Reverend Campbell is a pathetic part of the Rockefeller business interests, and we have our sympathies for him." I always thought that was a kind of a mean but funny line. We have our sympathies for him. So Foreman underlines that they are not attacking Campbell per se, or even the congregation, but are trying to draw a connection between Riverside's founding and the Rockefellers, who he says built a financial empire in oil, which is still exploiting people of color around the world. Foreman also mentions in this May 11th press conference that he's conscious of and intentionally playing upon known divisions at the time between the Board of Deacons and the Board of Trustees. He called the Board of Trustees a rich, white, racist businessmen who are manipulating the church for their financial interests and legitimacy. So again, he goes back to what I was trying to illustrate about with Rockefeller's early association with the church. He's saying that these people associate themselves with the church as a means of laundering their image. They're, on the one hand, they're taking part in these international labor abuses, and then on the other hand, they're kind of burnishing their image by being associated with this liberal and progressive church. So much as the internal and external response to King's Beyond Vietnam had been overwhelmingly negative in some quarters, it was also incredibly negative, probably even much more strongly, towards Foreman's Black Manifesto. And I think in the Riverside Archive, we have a pretty incredible collection of various political cartoons about the Black Manifesto event, and they are some of the most racist political cartoons you've ever seen. So there was an incredibly negative national response to this event. in fact, Francis Stewart Harmon, who was a board member of Riverside Church, published an op-ed in the New York Times just a few weeks later, saying that the demands from irresponsible persons and ad hoc groups for reparations from churches and synagogues are couched these days in increasingly fantastic terms. Their unreality is matched by the response of those who seem to find emotional release in public self-flagellation. Campbell, for his part, the senior minister at the time, responded fairly positively to the concept of reparations as such, but he was very quick as well to distance himself from Foreman specifically. And he even says here, he says, on the one hand, surely it is beyond dispute by now that the white man in this country has not done right by the black man. Before a black child says his first word or takes his first step in our society, he is handicapped. That system dates back to slavery, which was instituted by our fathers, but it has been perpetuated and confirmed by us, their sons, to our political, material, and social advantage. But he goes on to say, reparations, yes. Revolution, no. So he's very quick, again, to sort of, confirm and agree with the concept of reparations, but he really wants to distance himself from Foreman and from any sort of revolutionary ideas or ideas that would, sort of permanently alter sort of the relations in America. So I wanted to underline in this section some of the other continuing debates and contradictions in Riverside's history of social justice. In King's words from his letter from Birmingham jail in 1963, he said, "I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's greatest stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action." King's letter at the time in 1963 was addressed to white ministers in the South, but I think it's easy to imagine this same statement could have been made about some of King's reception at Riverside, where some of the leading members of the congregation may have been, both on the one hand, benefited from being associated with King and his progressive ideas, but at the same time were really unwilling to support him when in his more direct action approach to desegregation. He was doing more than just letter writing. He was doing sort of these direct actions, sit-ins, marches, really confronting segregation and the de facto segregation in the North. These tensions between the portion of the congregation which was committed to the Black freedom struggle by any means necessary, and a minority, but a powerful minority in the congregation, which fits more into this white moderate mold that King talks about here. I think that's put front and center again during Foreman's invasion of the chancel. Riverside was confronted with this tension and sort of forced to navigate this schism. I think also, additionally, Foreman's invasion of the chancel in particular kind of again confronts Riverside with its association with Rockefeller and with this contradiction between the social gospel style of the founding senior minister Fosdick and the sort of public relations driven philanthropy which had sort of defined the Rockefeller relationship with Riverside. So I think we see again there's these tensions that were there from the beginning, and then also this is sort of an example of another sort of set of controversies which again I think sort of underline what was going on in America at the time and what was going on in Riverside at the time, and offer some insight into sort of what happens with social movements today as well. Are there any questions or thoughts about that section?
Also, if anybody was there,
Yeah, please.
please share. Please share what it was like. That
Yeah.
would be amazing. I mean, we have the audio.
Yes.
We don't have video. There is video of Beyond Vietnam that we do not own. It's extremely expensive to get. Who owns it again? I forget.
CBS, I think.
CBS. So
Archive.
super expensive. It was in the recent Spike Lee movie, right? At the documentary at the end, there's a little bit of it of that.
Yeah, it's been in several things recently. It's in the recent Spike Lee movie, the Five Bloods. And it's also apparently, I haven't seen it yet, but it's apparently at the beginning or in part of that new movie about the Chicago 7 that's on Netflix, the Aaron Sorkin movie. Apparently it's also used in that. It's been used a lot recently.
Yeah. So yeah, if anyone was there or heard any of his, I should know this number. What is it, 6 or 7 times he spoke?
I believe
6.
it was 5 or 6. Yes.
Okay. Please share. I see a couple of hands raised. So Penelope, if you want to share, and then Emily, we can, yeah. So just please unmute yourself and go ahead.
Yeah, I wasn't there at Riverside, but I was at the University of Chicago when King was in Chicago for that campaign. And it was very unsuccessful. It was really, there was a lot of trouble, a lot of disturbance. He never got a foothold there and actually cut it short because it was so unsuccessful. It was sad.
Yeah.
It was sad to me, but that's how it was.
Yeah.
I think you needed a different strategy in the North from the South. You couldn't take the same strategy.
And what year was that, Penelope?
I believe it was 66.
66. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It wasn't until I think it was very soon after he was assassinated that the Fair Housing Act did pass. But at the time in 1966, the campaign was more or less unsuccessful, unfortunately.
I mean, bricks were thrown and at them and so on.
Yes.
And the other thing I want to say is from reading Fosdick, yes, there is the PR dimension of Rockefeller, but I think there was also the genuine part of Rockefeller's participation in Riverside. We're complex human beings,
Mm-hmm.
And he could be this industrialist and doing this and that versus labor and still having following Fosdick and
If
so
you remember in the first
class, I think it was both.
Yeah, we talked about that a little bit in the first class. If you remember, Rockefeller's sort of religious upbringing and that sort of idea. So and then in the sermons class, which was that just last week, we did talk about that a little bit too. Dr. Ryan Harper sort of mentioned the not conflicting, but the multi-dimensional character of Rockefeller and his motives for building the church. So absolutely, yes. Thank you for that. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Emily, did you want to?
Sure, I'll just chime in. As background, my family joined Riverside. My father had been at Columbia as a student in the late 40s and 50s and fell in love with Riverside and Fosdick and what his message was and what was happening at Riverside. He also fell in love with the music. He was a musician, classical and jazz, and loved the music. Actually, there's a scholarship in his name at Riverside.
Oh, wow.
When he died.
Can you email that to me?
Excuse me?
Can you email that to me?
I've got to find it because I will.
I'll look for it as well.
Okay, yeah. His name was George Walker, and he's in a bunch of archives, but he's in the columbarium also. He's there. So I was part of, a liberal white family, progressive, coming to Riverside for a reason, because of Fosdick, because of what we were all about.
Yeah.
And believed in this so deeply. unlike my friends from Tarrytown and Elmsford, where I live and am sitting right now, unlike many of our family, all of that. And my sister and I and my mother and father we're lifers here. So moving through, here, and as a child, so again, I actually wrong, I'm 64, not 63. But, so those were years I was a child, and I was in Sunday school for a lot of the sermons, and I would hear about King's sermons, and I would talk to my parents about it. And that's why we were there. And that's why, we were finding this niche in our world to grow within this and to work with social justice. And again, as I said, I was a child. My parents were very progressive and were part of a lot of the organizations that were progressive. And my mother she was on the search committee for Coffin. I mean, like all of this stuff. But I remember, talking about it in Sunday school. I remember all of that and coming back and forth and understanding that the grownups and the, and being part of the white population at Riverside, knowing that there were many families and, that this other history was there. I also grew up in Botanical Hills, which is the Rockefeller home. He donated the land for my little public school. I kind of grew up with Rockefellers and understood the social justice nature of the family and understood what Penelope was referring to, that other side of him. So all of this was happening as I was sort of growing, but I was sitting in church when Foreman stormed the, it is bringing back, I'm emotional about the moment. Because, and we were sitting up in the second balcony because my father always wanted to sit up in the second balcony because the music is better up there and you can hear better. And it was, so we were always in the second balcony. And I remember the moment, it's so vividly. And I remember everyone leaving. I remember my parents, I remember feeling very unsafe as a child. It was a scary moment because it was so un-Riverside. And it was so scary because we believed in, like the message and just what you were saying, Campbell, and as you articulated, that was great. It was an interesting way of framing it because I didn't feel that he was, and I was 12, or 13. I felt unsafe. And I remember that because there were so many mixed feelings about what was happening at the moment. And when had anyone ever stormed our chancel? How did that, what was happening and what would happen next? And we were in the middle of riots. We were in the middle of, Columbia in our lives. There was a lot of unsafety in terms of how people were reacting. And so I remember that. And I remember my father saying, I think we need to leave. I think we need to go home. And as everyone, and that, as he was saying that, and we were going to the elevator to go down, and I remember everybody started coming out, and it was people didn't, just as you're describing, all these mixed conversations, this mix, like, okay, we need to leave. And I think we decided to leave right before whether there was that moment of we're all leaving or not. I just remember the crowds. I just remember all of us going. And then of course, all the conversations afterward. But as a person who was sort of processing it, and I was thinking like, I get what he's saying, but he shouldn't have done it that way. It was sort of that youthful processing of it, which then led to lots of other processing as a congregation and, all sorts of things.
We actually have a box in the archive that is just devoted to reactions from the congregation and from folks, I guess, around the nation, writing letters and having these mixed feelings. So a lot of folks, a lot of the arguments were, okay, this wasn't the place to do it during worship. It's a sacred moment. It's a sacred service. shouldn't do it there. And then the others were like, no, this was the best time to do it. So there's a lot of conflicting viewpoints. And it was a very, I mean, it's just so interesting to go through the archival material. And because that's as close as we can get to it. But having you tell us is amazing that you were there and you remember that, and that your feeling of unsafety is actually really quite interesting. I did not get that from the archival material. Like people might have felt that way. So thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
Excuse me, Emily, how old were you at the time?
I was 12.
Okay, thanks so much.
Yeah.
Thank you. So Linda Lewis, you have your hand raised if you'd like to make a comment. Thank you, Emily, for sharing that. That's amazing.
I was not there for the Foreman episode, but I was there for Beyond Vietnam. I was in the middle of a 3-year search for a new church, but something kept drawing me to Riverside. I never could figure that out. The music, the people, and one sign I had, God, please give me a sign. My former high school teacher, Hilda Webster, if you look her up in the archives, I'm sure she's in there. I met her there on that Sunday. Wow. And she said, you're going to join Riverside, you're going to do the B's and P's, you're going to do that. I went, you know. But anyway, the attitudes had changed such. There was a lot of looking around. There were a lot of side eyes in 1967, as opposed to getting up when Foreman came and then walking out. You could, where Riverside, I think, was a little more polite then, but you could feel the tension in the building when Dr. King gave that speech. Yeah. He could give the same speech today and he'd be perfectly right.
Yeah, absolutely.
He's perfect. He would be perfectly right. But I happened to have been there on that particular Sunday.
That's amazing.
And it was like people were looking around. Why is he saying this? But it wasn't the outright. I'm quite sure you can find some letters in the archives that would talk about that. Yeah. As well. Yeah. The reactions to that. But I was my mom and I were in the building that day.
Yeah. Yes, we have stacks and stacks of letters to the senior ministers, but for both events, for Beyond Vietnam and for Foreman. There was actually a bomb threat against Riverside following the Foreman event, and it was all kinds of controversy. It was very, very extreme, especially after Foreman. I think, even though there was. I think, as you say, Linda, the politeness shift, isn't it? Even though it's only 2 years, there's a real difference in the level of politeness about the negative response. People were negative about King, but they were not insulting King per se.
I mean, they had the looks and they had the side eyes, but they sat there.
Yeah, it's a quieter. Yes.
It was a quieter revolt, as it were.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think especially as I mentioned before, we have just reams and reams of these like political cartoons of Foreman, and it's just 2 years later, but the extremity of the sort of negativity about it is really kind of galling today. Incredible. Is there anything else before I move on to? I have a very short last section, but I'm very happy just to keep talking.
We have a chat from Doug Miller. I served on MSJ as commissioner, and we highlighted this time of history at Riverside and Worship 2 years ago.
Great.
Yep.
Wonderful.
Yep. And last year, I think, right, Vince? We did the 50th anniversary of Foreman, and we did a little exhibit, and
it was 5 years ago, but yes, I think it was just last year.
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting, and I think to Vince, it's a very long year. To Vince's point that and to Doug's point, like, we're highlighting this time at Riverside now because we have the benefit of hindsight, but at the time, as both Emily and Linda have illustrated, like, it wasn't so clear cut. It wasn't like oh no, this is great things are happening for social justice. It wasn't as, as one-sided as when we look at these events today. We're like, wow, that was great, that was so progressive, that was awesome, and we're claiming it as our own, we're celebrating it, and we're highlighting it. But it was, within the context of the time, it was not the same. All right, thank you. So I think, Vince, you just have a small
really
section
quick
to like
section.
wrap this up.
Yeah, I'll try to run through it pretty quickly. But for the last section, I just wanted to, again, this sort of, I thought this era of Riverside's history kind of tied together a lot of the strands from the previous two sections, and that was sort of during Coffin's time at Riverside and the disarmament program. As I said, there's a whole host of things that even during Coffin's time, Maranatha, the Sanctuary Program, there's so much social justice history here at Riverside, it would be kind of impossible to go through each and every event. But specifically, I thought that Coffin's disarmament program was interesting in the context of the last two sections. And so William Sloane Coffin was called to lead Riverside in November of 1977. Among other things, Coffin had been arrested during the Freedom Rides in 1961 to register voters in the South. And then during the later 60s, he joined the ministry and he became a member of the Clergy and Laymen Concerned About Vietnam. It's the same organization which put together the event where Beyond Vietnam was delivered. Clergy and Laymen Concerned About Vietnam was being actively surveilled by the FBI from the outset, which I is kind of interesting. I think there's supposed to be a rule about surveilling religious organizations, but maybe they got around that somehow. In 1968, Coffin was by then the chaplain at Yale and kind of had a notoriety for being very early in advising his students at Yale to become conscientious objectors. And in 68, along with the anti-war activist and the famous baby doctor, Benjamin Spock, they were both brought up on conspiracy to counsel, aid, and abet draftable men to avoid military services. In 1967, the year before, LBJ had ordered his attorney general, Ramsey Clark, to have all draft resistors prosecuted or inducted into the Army. And the case against Spock and Coffin, and there were three other men, they were the Boston Five is what they became to be known. This was sort of the opening salvo in Johnson's war against the anti-war movement. And Ramsey Clark was kind of trying to avoid the bad press that would probably have come from just indicting thousands of young people. So instead they decided, let's go after these five prominent anti-war activists and try to sort of bring them up on charges for resisting the war. And so this was the beginning of a campaign of escalation and intensification of the government's attempts to quash anti-war dissent. And it would lead, for example, to the trial of the Chicago Seven. There was just, as I mentioned earlier, there's just a movie made about that. And then, you could arguably sort of, this anti-war, this is beginning of this escalation of this anti-war campaign by the Johnson administration. And Spock and Coffin were both convicted and sentenced to 2 years in prison, but the conviction was thrown out on appeal the following year. So just all that's kind of background as to who Coffin was and his associations. He was an activist and a very early sort of strong supporter of the Civil Rights Campaign and the anti-war movement. And so he joins Riverside in November of 1977, and in May of 1978, following a unanimous vote by the deacons, Riverside began a national campaign to reverse the arms race. This was primarily meant to celebrate the 100th anniversary of Harry Emerson Fosdick. It was specifically a reference to the hymn by Fosdick, God of Grace and God of Glory. One of the lines is, "Cure thy children's warring madness," which I think actually I realized as I was reading it earlier, King kind of refers to that line in Beyond Vietnam a little bit. He says something about war and madness, but specifically, again, Coffin is kind of calling to mind Fosdick's social gospel style, and he's taking this line from Fosdick's hymn, cure thy children's warring madness, and you know, let's build a campaign around this idea. So in 1978 was also the same year that the United Nations was hosting its first general session on disarmament. So it was felt by the deacons and by Coffin that this was like a fitting way to celebrate that year. It's also worth recalling that this was just 3 years after the fall of Saigon and the sort of effective end of the Vietnam War, and so it was felt by many in the anti-war movement that it now had to kind of reform and rebuild itself into a movement that could provide relief to countries affected by war and to sort of attempt to prevent new wars. So the hope was to, you know, recall that in Beyond Vietnam, King had predicted that there would be other Vietnams in Central America and Africa and elsewhere if the sort of Vietnam War machine was not dismantled. And so the sentiment in 1978 was trying to reorient the anti-war movement against Vietnam into sort of a longer-term campaign against war in general and against nuclear arms, and to kind of call out the worst excesses of the Cold War buildup. Coffin also, you know, I put this in here. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Doonesbury as a political cartoon, popular in the 70s and 80s. And actually Coffin was the inspiration for one of the characters in it. I think Gary Trudeau, who writes Doonesbury, had been at Yale at the same time as Coffin, and apparently seemed to kind of resent him in some way. I don't know if they had some run-in or something like that. But, you know, the view by some, Gary Trudeau among them, was that Coffin kind of associated with these progressive causes more as a means of kind of seeming like hip to young people and less out of personal conviction. In my studying of it, that doesn't strike me as very truthy, but that was certainly some of the public sentiment held that view, that this was like Coffin mainly held these views as like kind of as a public relations stunt for his church, and less so out of any deeply held personal conviction. I don't think that's the case, but it's interesting that this was seemingly a widely held view. But Coffin had also tied the disarmament campaign, to more pressing local issues for Riverside's congregation and community, saying, those of us who lived in New York City in the 1980s witnessed the gradual decay of literally everything not connected with profit making. Churches and synagogues could open shelters for the homeless, food pantries for the hungry, but as charity is no substitute for justice, there was little we could do to stem the growth of blighted neighborhoods where families and school systems were falling apart, drugs and guns flourishing. It was no mystery why so many people across the country were hungry and homeless. Preoccupation with external threats had led to gross neglect of internal reforms. Americans were destroying from within what presumably they were trying to protect from without. There was a growing consciousness at this time that Vietnam, as well as Korea and other wars, had effectively been proxy wars in the larger Cold War. Attempts by powers like the U.S. to prevent the growth and international support of the communist powers like the USSR and China. And as the 70s and 80s progressed, these sorts of proxy wars would continue to expand and multiply, and increasingly did not have any sort of major strenuous opposition or a huge organized anti-war movement in the same way that there had been in the 60s with Vietnam. You could attribute this to many things, probably most likely that, the fact that the draft didn't exist. So the draft had been reduced or ended. So there was not as much a direct threat to every man in America was under threat of having to be sent to Vietnam not so much in these sort of later proxy wars for the Cold War in the 70s and 80s. Coffin sort of specifically notes this too as being part of his interest in this disarmament campaign, saying, as clear as the relationship of disarmament to development was that of the Cold War to U.S. intervention in Grenada, Nicaragua, and El Salvador. In the 80s, President Reagan saw not only that evil empire in the Soviet Union, but a communist under every Central American Bush. So the structure of the disarmament program kind of reflected these two tracks that Coffin was referring to, both sort of the local community congregation level, as well as this like sort of grander international level of why this disarmament campaign was so important and valuable. On the one hand, they sponsored sort of scholarships, they sponsored studies done of disarmament. They held international conferences yearly, but they also sold T-shirts. They sold songbooks for children. They made posters that were distributed sort of throughout the city. There was sort of lots of local efforts to kind of engage the Riverside congregation, the Riverside community, and New York City into kind of thinking about, how does this sort of constant war buildup affect your local life? And in addition, putting that in the context of this broader international context of ongoing wars elsewhere outside of the United States. And the disarmament program probably arguably reached its apotheosis in January of 1987 with a visit of Oliver Tambo of the African National Congress to deliver the keynote address for the disarmament conference. Tambo was a close associate of Nelson Mandela's, and Tambo predicted the fall of apartheid and the rise of a non-racial democracy in South Africa. And it was only a few short years later that Mandela would finally be released from prison. And one of the first things he did was come to Riverside. And in his speech at Riverside, he specifically thanks the congregation for hosting Tambo. So this association too that we have with us, between us and Nelson Mandela, is kind of forged by Coffin's disarmament campaign and this invitation to have Oliver Tambo come speak at the disarmament conference. And Coffin would eventually leave Riverside at the end of 1987, the same year Oliver Tambo visited, to continue working full-time on disarmament causes. So again, I wanted to kind of draw here, again, some of these controversies and these themes that we're seeing throughout these things of Riverside's relationship to the international community. Again, Coffin has this sort of much more willingness than we've seen in previous senior ministers to kind of be associated with radicalism, and especially in his sort of vocal support of left-wing groups in Latin America, is really kind of like pushing the envelope and moving beyond kind of being a part of the establishment or church and kind of trying to really push this radical direction. And he's also sort of taking both Fosdick's social gospel style and also incorporating a lot of these important critiques that King and Foreman had made of America's foreign policy situation, and in this view that Foreman and King had spoken of in different ways of sort of the association of these sort of wealthy white businessmen who associated themselves with the church, and what their investments abroad were doing, and what their investments abroad, what how American foreign policy was driven by protecting those investments. Yeah, so that's basically what I have. I would love to hear. I'm sure some of you were here or involved in disarmament in some ways, and I would love to know more. I didn't have a ton of material to go through. So I'd love to hear more if anyone has any experience or thoughts about Coffin's disarmament program.
We lost the audio. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. I was at Riverside during the disarmament program. And one thing I just want to make sure that is understood by the people on the call is that like many other things at Riverside, it was very controversial. And not everybody supported that disarmament program, especially the beloved men's class. Okay. They thought that was just very inappropriate for Riverside. And especially because it was read by a Jewish woman, Cora Weiss.
Cora Weiss, yes.
That was a big problem, okay, for many of the, especially for many of the men at Riverside. It was not only that she was Jewish, it was run by a woman, okay? So you could just imagine what these old codgers thought of that.
Thank you. Yeah.
That's such a great. I had no idea. I knew that Cora Weiss was sort of running it, but I had no idea that that was a controversial choice. So that's very interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Excuse me, I have one thing to add, but I want to wait to the very end because I do not want to hijack Vince's presentation. And once I say it, that is all anyone is going to think of. So you let me know when you want me to say it, Vince.
Well, if anyone has any other questions, we can go to them first. But
We do.
I'm basically done. So I just want to sort of hear from other people what they thought. If they have any, if there were any other associations that they had, if anything I was talking about reminded them of other situations, I'd love to hear about that too. Because obviously I was only focusing in on these sort of 3 eras of Riverside's history, and there's so much more. There's much too much to cover in just an hour and a half.
We did have a question in the chat from Penelope. This goes back to the King photo. Can you tell us who the men are in the picture behind King? So when he's delivering sure. Beyond Vietnam, and yeah.
I can go back to that real quick. From the left, I believe it is Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel.
Yes.
And then next to him with the sunglasses is Dr. Henry Steele Commager, who was the head of the history department at UMass Amherst at the time. Maybe just, I always confuse Amherst and UMass Amherst. I think it was UMass Amherst, but I could be wrong. And then on the far right is John C. Bennett, the president of Union Theological Seminary at the time.
Okay. Thanks.
No problem. And something interesting was that, and I'll go a little more into this next week when we talk about WRVR's history, but we actually recently discovered or recovered the original recording of the Beyond Vietnam speech. And not only was it a much better quality than the version that's most widely known, it also includes the speeches afterwards, which usually are not heard when you listen to the widely played recording of Beyond Vietnam. It's just King's speech, but there was actually a whole program afterwards, as well as an interview with King. So there's even one of the sections that I read aloud is actually his response to a question during the Q&A period. And that whole part is usually lost or cut in most versions that you'd hear of Beyond Vietnam. So it has been very interesting sort of reading Heschel and Commager and Bennett's responses to King's speech and the things that they say as well. One of the things that was, sorry, go ahead.
No, finish your comment.
I was just going to say one of the things that was interesting too, and I left it out, but there was also a lot of controversy. King had compared the way that in Vietnam there was a program of like pulling people out of the villages and putting them into camps, and he compared that to concentration camps. And there was a huge amount of controversy in the Jewish community about that comparison. But interestingly, at the time, that night, someone had asked about that exact thing, and Abraham Joshua Heschel was sort of immediately sort of, you know, denied the comparison and sort of said, you know, that's not what MLK is saying. So just interesting. That was another sort of controversy, but again, we kind of miss that little color there of Heschel's response that evening in the version of Beyond Vietnam that we usually see and hear, which only includes King's words. Sorry, go ahead, Penelope.
Well, Vince, what I wanted to ask, someone said to me just as recently as last night that the space had been rented. And I understood you to say that it was a favor because more people than could fit at Union Theological were expected. Do you know if money changed hands, if the space was donated or rented?
That's a really good question, and I've wondered that myself. I don't have, I don't know that for sure.
Mm-hmm.
My hunch would be that there was not actually money changed hands, because I don't believe there was any fee to attend the event, and I think that it was just it was a favor to John C. Bennett, because there was, you know, there's obviously still, but there was very strong connections between Riverside and Union Theological Seminary. Many of the senior ministers have gone to Union Theological or taught at Union Theological, so there's a strong historical connection. And so my hunch is that it was just a favor to Bennett, but I really don't know.
Well, that's interesting too, because the other thing that person said was that it was attended not so much by Riverside members, but by people connected to the organization that was behind it. So I don't know if there's anybody in the class who would know, who was there, who would know whether or not Riverside members, you know, largely attended it or not.
Our Vince, I think our from the records, it seems that that Lynette, you're correct, that it wasn't like a widely attended Riverside event. And John, if you have any comments or any clarifications you want to make, please do say something. But I think that that's correct, that it was sort of like a closed event, and that Riversiders weren't weren't pouring in.
Yeah, that's what I was told.
I was a college student in Minnesota at the time. I have no idea.
Linda?
Yeah, Linda Lewis said that she was there. So Linda, do you have is she on the call? Maybe she dropped off. Yeah, Linda, I think Linda dropped off.
Yeah, I'm unmuted. Yeah, I'm unmuted. It was just, like I said before, it was a different type of reaction. I don't know if there were any other Riversiders there. I was just looking at how people looked at each other when he spoke.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That, we can't say anything, but what is he doing? And I don't remember how we heard about it, because we're going back to 1967.
No.
You're talking about Martin Luther King's speaking there, Linda?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, my hunch based on the photographs that we have of it is it's definitely it's a younger crowd. It's a very it's a very mixed race crowd, and there's a lot of media there as well. So my hunch is that it was much more heavily, Columbia students and people involved in the civil rights and anti-war movements were the majority there. But I don't think we have. I think we know that like 3,000 people were there, but I don't think we have anything like, a guest list or anything like that.
Yeah, and then Ruth J. Watson in the chat has said it was organized by Clergy and Lady United.
Clergy and laymen concerned about Vietnam. Yeah,
Mhm.
Yeah. It was their event.
Laity, international organization against the war.
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah, I may have heard about it through Hilda Webster
Mm.
at that point, who was
It
very,
was in all the press.
yeah,
Um,
who was very
the,
active.
the magazine, The Christian Century, probably has its complete a record
Mm.
on it.
But
But it's good to know that you have the original recording.
And I think next week we'll play. I mean, it's kind of like our dog and pony show that we do when we let folks know that we've got sort of rediscovered this recording. We play what was the well-known recording, and we contrast it immediately with our recording, and you can hear the difference, and it's so striking. So we'll do that next week when we go through the WRVR, because that was part of course, one of the recordings of that collection.
Yeah.
So yeah, we're very fortunate that we have this amazing, crisp, clear audio
Yeah.
that the world really hadn't heard before. Again, we'll do the comparison. It's really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Penelope, would you like to make a comment, or you have your hand raised, ask a question?
Yeah, that's great. We're going to hear the original recording. I'm interested also in hearing Heschel and the other speakers. Was that included as in the email that Vince, you sent us?
Yes. That web page has all of King's appearances, and it includes the entire program of Beyond Vietnam. So it includes the speech, which is the first hour or so, and then it includes the responses for the second hour.
Good.
Yeah, and Heschel and Commager's speeches are incredible on their own. Bennett is not a great public speaker, but Heschel and Commager's speeches on their own are they kind of pale in comparison to the beauty of Beyond Vietnam, but they on their own they would have been sort of incredible and fascinating.
Okay.
Speeches on their own. They're very worth listening to.
That's great. I want to listen to them. Yeah, thanks.
Highly recommend.
I'm not sure if any of you remember, right before the COVID pandemic, we were going to do an event. Do you remember this? It seems so long ago, but we were going to do an event commemorating this, where we were going to play the audio, not only of MLK, but of Heschel and the others, and do something really cool. We had the promotions out, we had the posters out, and then the pandemic hit, so we had to cancel it. So I don't know if you folks remember what I'm referring to. I think it was in Life with the Community. We had been promoting it, and we had really cool speakers that were going to come, including Cornel West. He was already on board, and then Heschel's daughter, who is also a professor, she was going to come and speak as well. So we're hoping that when the world goes back to some sense of normalcy and we can open the building and have a large gathering, that we can do that event. We were so close, and we had everything lined up, but then of course things happen. So just be on the lookout in the next year or so. Hopefully we'll be able to do that event, and play the audio, have these wonderful speakers come and react to it. So yeah, it's unfortunate. We're holding it for April, and then of course March hit and we had to cancel. If there's isn't any other comments or questions, I think we can go to John and have you blow our minds with with what you were going to share.
Okay, I have to take my glasses off and use my notes because I want to be very careful. First of all, this information is nothing that I have ever heard at the Riverside Church. Okay. However, I can report only what I have heard on PBS through various documentaries that describe the civil rights movement. And they are attributed to Reverend Andrew Young, who was a close associate of Dr. King during the last 4 years of his work in the Civil Rights Crusades,
Yeah.
and was later a UN ambassador to the United Nations under Jimmy Carter.
Mhm.
And I was then at Riverside as an usher. And during those days that he was in New York, Andrew Young was often in attendance at Riverside
Really?
to hear Dr. Coffin.
Mhm.
Not on the program, he was a parishioner, okay? But recently on PBS, in 2 instances, there was just a piece of, like a piece of information that Andrew Young dropped in an interview about the Civil Rights Crusades and Dr. King's work. And that was at the time Dr. King was assassinated, okay, which was in April of 1968.
Yeah.
He was undergoing final negotiations to have a pastorate at the Riverside Church.
Yes, I've heard that as well.
Okay, so I wanted to make sure the archives people knew about that, okay? They may have more information about that. I never heard of the Riverside. I've heard it twice on PBS.
Yeah.
And I think that since Andrew Young is currently alive at 88 years of age,
Yeah.
I think someone should contact him directly to find out what else he knows about this,
Yeah.
okay?
His-
My
his-
sus- I'm sorry.
His
My
his
sus-
family, so, sorry, go ahead.
My suspicion is this was, Dr. McCracken retired in the spring of 67.
Yes.
And the assassination was in April of 68, okay? And Dr. Campbell arrived in November of 68. So
Yeah.
this was in that interim period. My suspicion is that there might, and the second instance, when Andrew Young mentioned that, he said it was a 1-year arrangement. He didn't say that on the first instance I heard it. He said on the second, it was a 1-year arrangement. So
Yeah.
I assume it was not the senior minister's position, which would have been open at that time, because that would have been really just mind-blowing, especially for the trustees, which we had in those days. Absolutely mind-blowing to the trustees,
Yeah.
okay? It might have been something the deacons had been arranging for a social justice ministry, but I just wanted to make sure that that was heard on the call and ask the people in the archives if you think it's appropriate to do some research on that, because the man who spoke it is still alive.
Yeah.
We can find out what he knows.
Yes. Thank you. I think Vince and I I've never seen it in the archive, like written anywhere, or any documentation. I've heard it, like sort of like a rumor kind of thing. But yeah, we'll definitely look into that. That's
It's also,
really
I believe they also, I was going to bring it up before, but another film that the Beyond Vietnam film, the first time I saw the Beyond Vietnam, the film of it, which is it's only the first, like, it's not the entire thing. It's only part of it, but they show a little bit of it in the documentary that's on HBO called King in the Wilderness, which is about sort of King's last year and covers that Chicago campaign I mentioned, and then sort of the lead up to Beyond Vietnam, and then sort of it covers sort of his last 2 years before his assassination, and that is mentioned in that film as well, John, that he loved Riverside and had sort of been in maybe not official negotiations, but had been talking to people about wanting to take a pastorate there at some point. But yeah, I'm not certain if, I have not seen a lot of solid information or proof of that in the archive or anything like that.
but we'll look into it and we'll try to contact him. Maybe Michael.
We do have, we're also in touch with Clarence Jones, who is was one of the co-writers of several of King's speeches and was also a close associate later on, in addition to Andrew Young. Yeah.
I can be in touch. Andrew Young's family was also members, and I grew up with the kids. So the DePore family, that's his sister was the DePores. So Laddie and Lynn were my friends. We grew up together and are still friends of the family. So let me see what I can do. I'll see if I can
That would be
connect,
awesome.
because that they may know, they may not know, but
Yeah. That would be awesome. Thank you. Yeah, any lead would be great. Yeah, this is interesting. We have from Ruth J. Watson, the 1 year reference that John made suggests that it was consideration as interim senior minister, but those considerations were very private.
That would be my guess as well. Yeah.
That's possible as well. Yeah. We have a lot of, so John, you mentioned it would be the Board of Deacons. We have a lot of Board of Deacons papers that we can look through, because I would imagine archivally it might be there. That would be in a lot of the administrative papers, but yeah, we'll definitely take a look. Thank you. And if we can contact him, why not? Let's do it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, so thanks again for going the distance with us.
Yeah.
We always try to do like 1 hour and a half, but we somehow always make it to 2 hours. But
Yes.
we're really grateful for your participation and the discussion. So thanks again for going with us to 3 today. Next week, we'll talk about WRVR. We'll send you again via email some recordings that you can listen to, in addition to the ones that we did for King this week. And that one will talk a lot about the project that we've been doing, which is the digitization of the WRVR collection. That's what Vince has been doing for the past, I don't know, 2 years?
Something like that.
Year and a half, something like that. He's been managing that project. So we'll delve into that. That'll be a fun one. There'll be a lot of audio. If you have any questions, just email us or let us know. And thank you. And have a great rest of the day.
Thank you guys. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Take care.
Thank you.